There is a particular quality to the English countryside in the middle decades of the 19th century, a stillness that sits between industry and inheritance, between the noise of a modernizing nation and the deep, unhurried silence of its land and estates. It was an era of extraordinary contradiction. Factories were reshaping the northern skyline, railways were threading through ancient farmland, and the cities were swelling with a speed that no previous generation had witnessed. Yet amid this transformation, England's aristocracy continued to build. They built not in spite of the changing world around them, but in deliberate response to it. The Victorian country house was never simply a home. It was a statement of continuity, a physical argument that certain families had always been here and intended to remain. The architects commissioned during this period understood what was being asked of them. Their clients did not merely want comfort or elegance, though both were expected. They wanted permanence rendered in stone. They wanted the appearance of a dynasty that had existed before memory and would endure beyond it. The architectural vocabulary of the era, Gothic Revival towers, Italianate facades, baronial halls dressed in dark oak paneling, was chosen precisely because it borrowed from older traditions, grafting a sense of medieval rootedness onto structures that were, in many cases, entirely new. The social conditions that sustained this ambition were intricate and carefully maintained. Land ownership in Victorian England carried with it a web of obligations, privileges, and assumptions that had been accumulating for centuries. The great estate was not simply a private retreat, but the center of a small, self-sustaining world. It employed groundsmen, housekeepers, stable hands, and domestic staff whose livelihoods were bound entirely to the family at its center. The surrounding villages often depended on the estate's patronage, its rents, its seasonal work, its charitable distributions. To own such a property was to occupy a role that was simultaneously economic, political, and almost ceremonial in its weight. Within these houses, the arrangement of rooms followed a logic that was social before it was practical. The progression from entrance hall to drawing room to dining room was a choreography of hierarchy, each space calibrated to reinforce the distinctions between those who lived there and those who visited, between family and staff, between the public face of the household and its private interior. Light fell differently in each room, admitted generously into reception spaces, carefully rationed in the servants' quarters that ran in parallel worlds behind the main corridors. It is within this landscape, physical, social, and architectural, that the estate at the center of this documentary must first be understood. Before its particular history can be examined, before the specific family who built it can be introduced, it is necessary to grasp the world that made such places not only possible, but for a time, entirely inevitable. Victorian England did not stumble into its great houses. It built them with intention, with capital, and with a profound desire to be remembered.
Chapter 2. The Estate and the Family Behind It. Somewhere in the quieter counties of England, set back from a country lane by a long approach of lime trees and raked gravel, the estate announced itself before it was fully visible. This was not an accident of geography, but a deliberate calculation of arrival, the slow reveal of a house designed to be encountered gradually, its proportions emerging through the tree line at a pace that allowed the visitor time to absorb what they were approaching. The house had been positioned with the same intentionality that governed every other decision made in its design. The landscape was not simply a backdrop, it was the opening statement. Construction on the main house began in the early decades of the Victorian era, commissioned by a family whose wealth had been assembled across 2 generations through a combination of industrial investment, careful inheritance, and the kind of strategic land acquisition that defined the period's most ambitious provincial dynasties. They were not of ancient noble lineage. Their name did not appear in the earliest rolls of the English peerage, but by the middle of the 19th century they had accumulated sufficient capital and sufficient social confidence to undertake what such families invariably undertook when they reached a certain threshold. They built. The architect they engaged was a practitioner of considerable regional reputation, working in the Gothic revival idiom that had come to represent a particular vision of English permanence. His brief, as understood through the surviving correspondence of the period, was to produce a house that felt as though it had stood for generations, despite being entirely new. The result was a structure of considerable scale, a central block of dressed limestone flanked by asymmetrical wings, one housing the formal reception rooms, the other given over to the service arrangements that a household of this ambition required. Towers of varying height punctuated the roofline, their stonework carved with foliate detail that softened the severity of the overall composition without diminishing its authority. The founding patriarch who commissioned the house understood that architecture was biography rendered in material form. Every decision, the height of the entrance portico, the depth of the window reveals, the selection of local stone over imported alternatives, reflected a man engaged in the careful construction of a social identity as much as a physical one. The house was to communicate what the family had become, and equally what they intended their descendants to be understood as having always been. His wife oversaw the interior arrangements with equivalent deliberateness. The principal rooms were furnished in the fashionable manner of the period, but with a restraint that distinguished the household from those who decorated merely to display expenditure. The library was substantial and used. The morning room faced east by design, capturing the early light that she, by several accounts, particularly valued. From the moment the final courses of stone were laid and the scaffolding removed, the house and the family that built it existed as a single continuous thing, each defining and sustaining the other in ways that would take generations to fully unravel.
Chapter 3. Life Within the Walls. At the height of its occupation, the estate ran with the precision of a small, self-contained institution. The day began before dawn in the lower corridors and service wings, where the household staff moved through their appointed routines with a quietness that the family above would rarely hear and almost never see. Fires were laid and lit in the principal rooms before the first member of the family descended. Boots were cleaned, lamps trimmed, breakfast prepared, and the formal rooms set in order. All of it accomplished in the hours before the house, in its public sense, officially woke. This invisible labor was the engine upon which the visible life of the estate entirely depended. The household staff in a property of this scale would have numbered between 15 and 20 in residence, with additional workers employed on the grounds and in the home farm beyond the walled garden. The hierarchy among them was as carefully observed as any social distinction in the rooms above. The housekeeper and butler occupied positions of considerable domestic authority, each managing their respective domains, the interior arrangements and the formal service, with a formality that mirrored the expectations of the family they served. Below them, the gradations of rank descended through ladies' maids, footmen, kitchen staff, and scullery workers, each position defined by its proximity to the family and the nature of the work it required. For the family themselves, the rhythm of the year was structured by a calendar that balanced the demands of the estate with the obligations of county and London society. The summer months brought the house to its fullest life. Guests arrived for extended visits, the gardens were in formal display, and the drawing rooms were opened for the kind of unhurried sociability that the Victorian upper classes cultivated with considerable seriousness. The autumn turned attention to the shoots and the management of the surrounding land. Winter drew the household inward, the days shorter, the fires larger, the circle of occupation contracting to the family's immediate rooms. The estate's relationship with the surrounding community was consistent and carefully maintained.
The family held the principal tenancies of the nearby farms, the advowson of the parish church, and a position of customary authority over local affairs that was exercised through a combination of formal obligation and social expectation. Charitable distributions at particular seasons were a fixture of the household's calendar. The church pew reserved for the family was positioned, as was conventional, where it could be both seen and seen from. Within the house itself, the arrangement of daily life reflected a social architecture as deliberate as the stone one that contained it. Meals in the dining room followed a sequence of courses whose length and formality corresponded to the occasion and the company. The library was open to the family in the mornings, the drawing room belonged to the afternoons. Each room carried its own hour, its own light, and its own understood purpose, the house not merely sheltering a family, but organizing one.
Chapter 4. The Gathering Weight of Circumstance. The pressures that eventually reshape a great estate rarely arrive as single, identifiable events. They accumulate instead across decades, gathering weight in the margins of account books, in the succession of heirs who inherit obligations alongside property, and in the slow drift of a world that no longer organizes itself around the assumptions upon which such houses were built. For this estate, as for a considerable number of its contemporaries, the second half of the 19th century brought a gradual tightening of circumstance that was neither catastrophic nor immediately visible, but was nonetheless continuous and directional. The agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s affected landowners across England with a consistency that no amount of careful management could entirely absorb. Falling grain prices, competition from imported American wheat, and a succession of difficult harvests compressed the rental income upon which estates of this kind depended. The farms that surrounded the house, whose tenants had for generations provided the reliable financial foundation beneath the family's broader ambitions, began to return less. Rents were reduced, then reduced again. Some tenancies fell vacant and remained so. The estate's income and its expenditure, which had for decades maintained an acceptable if not generous equilibrium, began to diverge. At the same time, the demands upon that income were not diminishing. The house itself required continuous maintenance of a kind that its original construction, however well executed, could not eliminate. Roof lines needed periodic attention. The service wing, built to the practical standards of its era rather than its aesthetic ones, showed the effects of continuous heavy use. The formal gardens, whose upkeep had always required a staff of several men, became a quiet point of retrenchment, their geometries softening first at the edges, then more broadly, as the number of groundsmen was gradually reduced. Successive generations brought their own complications. The founding patriarch had been a man of singular financial focus, but inheritance does not reliably reproduce temperament alongside property. A later generation included members whose interests lay elsewhere, in London, in travel, in the pursuits that a certain level of inherited wealth made briefly available without demanding the sustained attention to estate management that would have been required to preserve its foundations. Decisions deferred have a cost that is not immediately legible, but becomes so in time. The broader historical currents of the period added further pressure. The death duties introduced by Harcourt's Finance Act of 1894 imposed for the first time a graduated tax on inherited estates, a change whose consequences would be felt most acutely not in the generation that witnessed its introduction, but in those that followed. Each successive inheritance carried with it a charge that reduced the capital available for the maintenance and investment the property required. None of these developments, taken individually, constituted a crisis. Taken together, across the span of 2 or 3 generations, they composed a pattern whose direction was consistent and whose ultimate consequences were, in retrospect, already present in the earliest signs of their beginning.
There is a particular quality to a house that has been left. It is not the same as a house that has been destroyed, nor one that has simply aged in continuous occupation. A left house retains the full architecture of its former life, the rooms, the proportions, the sequence of spaces designed for specific human purposes, while the life itself has withdrawn.
What remains is the container without its contents, and in that condition, a building begins to speak differently than it did when it was inhabited. The estate, in its later years, became this kind of place. The precise chronology of the family's withdrawal is, as with many such properties, not reducible to a single date. The house was not abandoned in a single decision, but vacated gradually, first the upper floors, then the principal reception rooms, then the remaining occupied wing, as the diminishing household contracted around whatever remained practical and affordable to maintain. Staff who retired or moved on were not replaced. Rooms were closed, their contents sheeted, their shutters drawn against light that no longer served any domestic purpose. The house did not empty suddenly, it thinned. By the early decades of the 20th century, those who passed along the lane beyond the lime tree approach would have observed a property whose condition told a legible story without requiring explanation. The formal gardens had surrendered their geometry entirely to unmanaged growth. The guttering that had begun to separate from the parapet in the previous generation had, in the absence of repair, continued its slow detachment. Damp, the particular enemy of the unheated Victorian interior, had found its way into the lower rooms, leaving its characteristic marks on plasterwork and paneling that had once been maintained with considerable care. Local memory, in the communities surrounding such properties, tends to fill the silence left by a withdrawing family with narratives of its own construction. The accounts recorded in parish histories, local newspapers, and the occasional memoir of the period reflect a house that had acquired, in the minds of those who observed it from the outside, a reputation shaped as much by its emptiness as by any documented event within it. The darkened windows, the ungoverned grounds, the absence of the familiar rhythms of a working household, these visible facts became the material from which local imagination assembled its own version of the property's history. What the historical record itself supports is more measured and, in its way, more consequential than folklore. The estate's later decades coincided with a period of significant social dislocation, the losses of the First World War, the economic contractions of the interwar years, the accelerating obsolescence of the country house as a viable domestic and economic unit. The family's experience was not exceptional. It was rather representative of a much broader pattern of aristocratic and gentry retreat from properties that the 19th century had built with such confidence and the 20th found increasingly impossible to sustain. The house stood through all of it, as stone tends to do, accumulating the evidence of each passing decade in its fabric.
England lost a great number of its country houses in the 20th century. The precise figures, assembled by architectural historians in the decades following the most acute period of demolition, are sobering in their cumulative weight. Hundreds of properties, some of considerable architectural distinction, others of more modest ambition but equal historical depth, were demolished, stripped, or allowed to decline beyond the point of practical recovery between the 1920s and the 1970s. The causes were consistent across cases: the intersection of punishing taxation, the collapse of the agricultural rental economy, the absence of heirs willing or able to sustain properties whose scale had become functionally incompatible with the domestic arrangements of the modern world. The estate at the center of this documentary was one among many, and understanding it as such does not diminish its particular history. It locates it accurately within the larger one. What such houses represented, at the height of their occupation, was a specific and historically bounded idea about the relationship between family, land, and permanence. The Victorian aristocracy and gentry who built or extended these properties were participating in a tradition of architectural self-definition that stretched back through the centuries, each generation adding its layer to a cultural conversation about what it meant to own land in England and to be seen owning it. The country house was simultaneously a private home, a public statement, an economic unit, and a social institution. When it ceased to function as any of these things, it did not become simply a building. It became a record. The question of what to do with such records has occupied preservationists, historians, and public bodies for the better part of a century.
The organizations established in the mid-20th century to address the accelerating loss of the architectural heritage, among them the National Trust, whose country house portfolio grew substantially in the post-war decades, operated with an understanding that these buildings contained within their fabric irreplaceable evidence of social, economic, and architectural history that could not be reconstructed once it was lost. Stone can be recut, but the specific accumulation of decisions, repairs, alterations, and occupations that constitute a building's true historical content cannot be replicated. Preservation, where it has been achieved, has preserved not just the aesthetic object, but the layered evidence it carries. For the houses that were not preserved, memory has taken over the work that stone can no longer perform. Local histories, photographic archives, estate papers held in county record offices, and the oral traditions of surrounding communities together constitute a form of institutional recollection that keeps the outline of vanished or diminished properties present in the historical consciousness of their regions. The estate examined here, whatever the current condition of its fabric, exists within this network of record and remembrance. History does not require a building to remain standing in order to retain its significance. It requires only that the evidence be gathered, the record maintained, and the story told with sufficient care and honesty to do justice to the people and the time that produced it. That, in the end, is what endures.